All right, shortly we'll be joined by economist Thabi Leoka and via Skype accountant and analyst Khaya Sithole for us. Khaya, bad news. Is this worse than you could have imagined?
Yeah, it is indeed terrible news, but I suspect the reality is that even if everything had worked well for us, if you look at the electricity crisis that we had towards the last couple of months of the year, it was always going to lead to these types of economic indicators that we're seeing now. So, of course, it is quite bad, but I think probably not as worse as it could have been, because if you look around, there's just very few things that are working within our economic architecture. And I think in this instance, there was, some sectors that worked well, unfortunately far too few, and others that are contracting at a rate that should really alarm us.
Are there any sectors that give us hope? Finance growing, some growth in some sectors, but overall decline.
I think the reality is that the sectors that would be giving us hope are sectors that have got a high capacity to absorb employees. So if, for example, I say that the finance sector grew by 1%, but that means 1,000 people, for example, and if I say to you, had it been the agricultural sector, I would have been able to absorb 2,000 or 3,000 people, then that has significant impacts, particularly for our unemployment statistics. So it's really a question now of the volumes of how many people can we be able to adopt into the economy. And when you do talk about high growth sectors, these high growth sectors shouldn't just be capital growing, but also it should be capital translating to greater job prospects. And I think in this particular case, we really need to start focusing on the high absorption in industries, tourism, for example, and perhaps even agriculture, rather than the highly technical and highly specialized skills industries like finance, for example.
Yeah, because this is just the worst news for anybody who's looking for employment, who doesn't have a job. Thabi Leoka joining us in studio. First, can we distinguish between technical and full-blown recession?
It's very interesting because not many countries use the technical term. South Africa is one of the very few. I don't like that term because I feel like it's almost, glossing over the reality of a recession. Because a recession in definition is two negative quarters, consecutive quarters, and that's exactly what we have.
But why do we say technical versus full-blown?
So I think that we're trying to distinguish between two consecutive quarters versus, let's say, the full year posting recession.
Yeah.
So what we saw in 2019 is a 0.2% growth. So that's a 0.2% just before we got to, before a recession or before contraction. And so we just missed a contraction in 2019.
And we could see another decline. I mean, the president today saying this is not unexpected because of load shedding. We've had load shedding, of course, in the first quarter of this year. So could we be in a full-blown recession without knowing it yet?
If you ask the man in the street, they will tell you that they feel like we've been in a recession for longer than just what we as economists point out as two consecutive quarters, because the man in the street is unemployed, the man in the street can't find a job, doesn't have the skills, income growth has been slow for the past 5 years. So I think that this year is going to be very tough. If you look at what happened in the last quarter of last year, there were two things that pushed the GDP growth down, and that is load shedding and also retail. The retail sector failed to perform as it usually does, leading
Black
up
Friday
to
and Christmas.
Despite that, we didn't employ as many people as we typically do, and not a lot of sales were done during that quarter. But now you know that during the first quarter, for the past couple of years, the first quarter has always been quite weak in South Africa. So this year, not only do we have load shedding, but also a weaker consumer base, but we also have the coronavirus and we've seen what it's done to the equity market and also to the currency. And, we've got our endogenous problems as well, including this wage negotiation, which at worst case scenario could lead to a strike. And I'm not saying that it will, but I'm just saying that we need to be aware of certain things. But a lot of it is endogenous, and we need to accept that we have created these problems.
Yeah, and you're right. A potentially huge strike is potentially on the cards. Khaya Sithole, what do you think this means for the coming year for 2020, given that we've got more load shedding and this potential strike?
Look, it's definitely not a good start to the year. And I think the reality here is that even in the past couple of weeks that we've seen big businesses like Dion White, for example, saying that they're actually closing down shop. You saw the numbers that came through from Mesmat the other day in that there is no reprieve in the short term. And as Thabi said, we must actually own up as a country and realize that far too many of the variables are things that we themselves have actually used to shoot ourselves down in the foot, which are the endogenous factors. So, of course, the world of the economy and the entire global markets operate at a particular pace. But I think in the South African context, there are far too many things that we do not help the conversation. Even this concept of the public sector having to be cut down. The problem is not that the country is committing to do that, but the problem is the way the finance ministers approach the process, where labor unions feel that they're ambushed at the very last moment for the budget speech. That is not the type of thing that we should be engaging in, particularly when we have so many issues that we need to resolve.
Khaya,
so I think
such a pity. I'm going to stop you there because your line has just become bad when I wanted to listen to what you were saying. But saying we're shooting ourselves in the foot, give us a solution, one solution.
You know, I think
that's
that it is sad that we've left the low-hanging fruits and now they're becoming fewer and fewer. I keep saying that we need to release spectrum as quickly as possible because I think it's a game changer. I think that we need to, what I heard from what Khaya was saying, and it's absolutely true, that you shoot yourself in the foot by putting Labour in a predicament because you announced that you're going to raise 160 billion rand over 3 years without actually consulting them. So obviously that could cause tension in the labour market. That's unnecessary given the state of the economy.
Of the budget. I've got time for one more question. And you mentioned coronavirus, huge because our exports aren't going to China as well.
Yeah, if you look at the GDP numbers, there's, especially on the expenditure side, there are only two positive numbers. That's household consumption and exports. And, you know, China is our big export market. And if there's a decline in that, and not just China, but the rest of the world as a result of corona virus, then we'll see our export sector also decline, which is obviously negative for growth. And we'll also see that in our tourism numbers, and we're trying to grow the economy also through tourism and putting a lot of investment in attracting tourists back into South Africa after various policies that didn't work, and now with the coronavirus that could put span in the works.
And I know of at least one big international conference that was to be held in Cape Town cancelled because of coronavirus. Thank you very much, Thabi Leoka, economist, Khaya Sithole, accountant and analyst for us.